During the Cold War era, many creators began to capitalize on the fear, uncertainty, and dread that people felt after witnessing the destructive capabilities of nuclear weapons at the end of World War II. And they pushed this nuclear holocaust narrative into the genre of post-apocalyptic fiction by publishing novels and comic books and TV shows and movies, and yes, role-playing games. We're going to talk about D&D's post-apocalyptic cousin, Gamma World, today on Daddy Rolled a One. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin, and this is another in my series of videos on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons, and one of the companies that published them, Tactical Studies Rules, and one of its later descendant companies, TSR Hobbies. So today we're going to be talking about Gamma World, and this is part of D&D history in a way because there are a lot of concepts and scenarios and things that come up in Dungeons & Dragons that actually end up having their genesis from either Gamma World or its predecessor game that's known as Metamorphosis Alpha, which we're also going to be talking about today. So to start out, we want to talk about, why are we talking about this? And again, it is because it is, I consider it part of, it's definitely part of the history of TSR, but it's one of the earliest role-playing games that was published. And a lot of the concepts in here did end up influencing things in later editions of Dungeons and Dragons. So also, as Gary Gygax and Brian Bloom put it in the foreword or the introduction to Metamorphosis Alpha, again, which is a game that's very related to Gamma World, they talk about the idea that if you have an existing D&D campaign, you might be looking for new ideas. And because the mechanics are very, very similar, you can pull ideas from Metamorphosis Alpha or from Gamma World and put them into your D&D game. And I think that's a great way to look at it as well. If you're looking for something new and fun and creative to challenge your players, looking to other games and pulling things out is a great way that you can do it without needing to learn a whole new system if you don't really want to. So just quickly to talk about how Gamma World came about, we need to talk about a gentleman by the name of James M. Ward. I've mentioned him briefly before, but James was a person who played in Gary Gygax's Lake Geneva campaign. And the way that they met is really kind of a funny story. So the way that James tells it, he was at a bookstore, and I think it was Tuesday, like every Tuesday, this bookstore got in like new science fiction fantasy books. And so, this is like the early 70s. And so he's at this store on a Tuesday and he's picking books off the shelf like Conan the Barbarian and things like that. And there's a guy next to him who's also picking up books, and they're not really paying attention until like James, I guess, has this pile of books and he turns to go look at this other gentleman who has, as James says, the exact same books in his pile. And they kind of chuckle over it. Well, it turns out that other person was Gary Gygax. And so Gary says to James, like, hey, I have a game that you can play if you'd like to try out, where you can play as Conan in the game and you can fight Set, who, like the evil serpent god from the Conan stories. And James Ward's like, I'm sold, like I'm there. And I always kind of laugh at that story because that is basically how I got into playing Dungeons and Dragons. I was reading mythology books and King Arthur stories in my English class, and at lunchtime at school in high school or junior high school. I was in 6th grade, and some players saw me, some people, and they said, hey, I see that you're reading, King Arthur. Have you ever read like Lord of the Rings? And I was like, oh, I've read The Hobbit and I've started to read Lord of the Rings, but, I didn't get very far in Fellowship yet, but, whatever. And they said, oh, well, how would you like to be introduced to a game where you can play Strider from Lord of the Rings and you can fight like a bunch of orcs and goblins? And I thought that sounds really cool. And so, again, I always thought it was really funny that James Ward was introduced to the game in a very, very similar manner. So anyway, he ends up playing in Gary Gygax's Lake Geneva campaign. They're playing early, 74, like right after the game is released. And James says to Gary, hey, what would be fun is you should have a science fiction version of Dungeons and Dragons, a science fiction game. And Gary said, that's a great idea, but, I'm really busy right now. Why don't you write it? Now, again, this is all coming from James Ward's, interviews and things that I've either read or listened to him talk about. But Gary basically says, hey, James, can you work? Now, James already had a full-time job. As I recall, he was a teacher. and he was teaching, I think it was like English and history. Now, I don't remember what grades he was teaching, whether this is like high school or college level, but in any event, he's working. And so he ends up, it takes him about 2 years to write the game because he's kind of working on it in his spare time when he's not doing his teaching job. So he works on this game that gets play tested at TSR, and they do eventually publish it in 1976. And that's this game, Metamorphosis Alpha. So this is the whole game. It's a pretty thin book, maybe 32 pages. Yep, exactly 32. And now this is different from the other games that TSR has published at this time for the most part. So we know that TSR had published the original Dungeons and Dragons game in those small digest-sized books. Then they published Boot Hill in 1975, which is also a digest-sized book. And they published Empire of the Petal Throne as a boxed set. So you guys have seen this before on the channel. I've talked about this several times. And this has a full-size book as well, but much, much thicker, as you see there, than Metamorphosis Alpha. But this is James's game, Metamorphosis Alpha. And I'm not going to get too deep into the mechanics here, but the gist of it is that the way James describes it again is that he was trying to make it different from Dungeons and Dragons. And remember, at the time when this comes out, the Dungeons and Dragons we're talking about is the original Dungeons and Dragons, those 3 little brown books in the box, the small box. And the Holmes Basic set has not been published yet, and the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons had not been published yet. So he is working on this. And so his only exposure to a role-playing game at the time he starts working on this is Dungeons and Dragons. But he wants to make it different because, again, as he describes it, like he was sort of thinking ahead. And his thinking was like, I'm going to write this game, and if I make it mechanically identical to Dungeons and Dragons, then I can't really say it's my creation, and then he wouldn't own it. So one of the cool things is James Ward, he's a very early employee of TSR. There almost at the very beginning. And he is, fortunately for him, unfortunately for us, in that some of the old timers original people or unfortunately have been passing away lately, not just lately. But James is still with us. So that's great that he's still here. He's very active. And there's a group on Facebook called, I think it's called Ancient Dungeons and Dragons, something like that. But basically you can find him in there, and he will comment from time to time and jump in there. And he has, I think, his own page as well and things like that. So anyway, but he is trying to, he owns the rights to this day still, which is great. So he was business savvy enough to kind of think about that, because at the time, probably, I'm guessing people just that wasn't really on their minds. There's also the ideas like, oh, you can't copyright game mechanics. So, I get that as well. But anyway, he's kind of thinking ahead, and he's at the forefront of this idea that, he's going to create something that he wants to own the rights to later on. But that said, his real only exposure to role-playing games was Dungeons and Dragons, because it was a brand new industry. It's a brand new genre. That genre of games didn't exist. Now, by the time that this does get published, a few others have come out. So I talked about Boot Hill, 1975. That is more of kind of like it's more of a strategic, what we would now call like a PvP, like player versus player game of gunslinging. That's what it is. So the mechanics in that game, the ability scores are different from D&D's ability scores, and they are things like your bravery and your shooting ability, throwing ability, your strength and your speed, and they're all on a percentile basis. Okay, so the mechanics are different. However, when James started working on that, he hadn't seen that game. Okay, now we talked a second ago about Empire of the Petal Throne. That mechanically is almost identical to D&D. It has 6 ability scores. Now those ability scores, as I recall, are based on a percentage basis, but they're roughly the same 6 that are in D&D. This also has 6 ability scores, or 5, depending on what kind of character you play. So the difference here is that your ability scores are your radiation resistance, your sorry, I'm right here. So your radiation resistance, and then you have your mental resistance, and then you have your dexterity, your strength, and then your leadership potential, but you only get the leadership potential, which is kind of like charisma. It's what it's good for is like leading other people, obviously by the name, like your henchmen, your hirelings, things like that, how many you can have and what type you can have. That's only available to pure humans in this game, what they call pure strain humans. So there are no classes in this game, which was different from D&D. It has, I guess, what you would call species or races, or however you want to say that, which are in a way sort of like the later versions of the race as class that you see in basic D&D, like the BX version and also in the BECME version and the Rules Cyclopedia, where you play a dwarf and that's your race and your class combined. So in here you have pure strain humans, you have mutated humans, and you have mutated animals. So those are kind of like your three choices, and each one has different abilities. So interestingly enough, it's just, we can jump in and just talk about, first off, you have this forward here. And this is the section I was talking about earlier in the intro, where I said, on the other hand, the existing parallels in the games make it a simple move for the players to go from one to the other. And those with existing Dungeons & Dragons campaigns may wish to incorporate ideas from this game into their campaign work. We're actually going to talk about that in a second, about moving characters back and forth between, say, Dungeons & Dragons and Metamorphosis Alpha. But you see you've got some art here. And it's just kind of like, again, modern design. I think we take certain things for granted in terms of how do you present a role-playing game to teach someone how to play. So it talks out and it has this introduction, but it's not it doesn't tell you that you're playing a game at this point. It gives you this kind of like end game fiction for the introduction. And then it gets into like, oh, there was this great disaster. And then it gets into a little bit of like, okay, you're playing a game. And so here's what you can have: one referee and up to 2 to 24 players, which is hilarious, thinking of running 24 players. We have talked about this a little bit before, but a lot of times the idea is that you wouldn't necessarily have 24 players at one time, but you could have up to 24 players broken into individual groups, and they're all exploring. And the idea is that they're all exploring kind of, well, they're exploring the same dungeon, let's say. In this case, it's a starship. But they can interact with each other. But usually what's going to happen is one group is going to be dealing with the aftermath of what another group has done. Okay, so that's what they're talking about with like having multiple groups. So say that like, you're on a quest to go find a relic or something like that. If the other group gets to it first, that relic is not going to be there by the time your group shows up. So they used to play in what they called real time, which is and they had to keep strict time records. And these are all kind of like little memes that you can find if you look for them online. But the idea was that what one group did was going to affect what other groups did, because they're all playing in the same scenario, just not necessarily at the same time. And they're not necessarily cooperating. They could be at odds. And it's because, again, these are coming out of war games where like you would have a winner. So like one group might get more stuff because they decided to keep playing longer. And, they didn't, it was a weekend. They didn't have to go to sleep, whatever it was. Right. So they're going to play for 8 hours. Another group might only play for 3 hours and not get as far. Right. And when they're playing at a different day. And so the things that the first group found are no longer there. Hopefully I'm explaining that to make sense to you. But this game, the premise of it is that it takes place on what they call the generation ship. So my book is unfortunately in not great shape. And this is not my original book. This is something I acquired much later. But there's a picture of the ship up there. I'm trying to be very careful because I'm very afraid the spine is going to split. I've got some kind of fun creatures and stuff there. It takes place on a generation ship. What's the idea of this is that it's a genre of science fiction where you would have a ship that's traveling to basically go colonize a new world. And it takes so long to get there that over time, you'd have like multiple generations of people being born and dying on the ship before it finally gets there, which means you have to train people how to operate the ship, because at some point you're no longer going to be there. The pilot's going to be dead. The original people, the original engineers and the pilots and the navigators and all that stuff, the captain, they have to teach things to the newer generations and to keep them going. Other times they'll do things like put people in the deep freeze or whatever it is. But And you've usually got some kind of like robots or androids or artificial whatever to kind of like teach people and keep things moving. Okay, so the premise of this game is that you're on this generation ship, and what happens is on its way to its destination, it encounters this big radiation cloud, and the captain had to make a decision. Do I want to go around the cloud, which will add like many, many more years to us reaching our destination, because they didn't know this cloud was there? Or am I just going to put the shields up on my ship and power through, and we'll probably be okay because we're on this like very technologically advanced ship and we've got our shields up. So he flies through. Well, as it turns out, the shields weren't enough, and the radiation mutates or kills basically every living thing on the ship. And it also affects the machinery, where like the computers and all that kind of stuff, and the robots, they break down and or lose whatever memory that they had. Or it like maybe like reprogrammed it, where now the robots are like murder robots or whatever, right? So that's kind of the premise of this game. So James Ward designs it that way on purpose because, again, his exposure to playing role-playing games was exploring a dungeon. And so the way he thought of this was a dungeon in space. And that's really what this is. The Generation ship, it's huge, but it is a self-contained dungeon with multiple levels, right? I think this one it's either 17 or 18 levels, the example that he gives in the book. And so characters can go from level to level, just like going from level to level in a dungeon. So once you kind of understand that, like, James was thinking about this in the context of exploring a dungeon, but in a science fiction setting, putting it on a generation ship makes sense. Now, adding the little twist of the radiation thing is a fun idea because it adds a whole new kind of creative thing to explore in this game that isn't necessarily part of D&D. So that's kind of fun. Now, where did James come up with this idea, these generation ships? Where do you get that? Well, he specifically says the one that influenced him the most is a book by Brian Aldiss named Starship. I think it was originally called Nonstop, and then it was renamed Starship for whatever reason. I guess it's a little bit more, you could tell what genre it is from the name Starship, whereas Nonstop is sort of a neutral term that you wouldn't know what it is. But this is published around 1958. And in the book, it takes place on a generation ship that ends up picking up an alien parasite, they called it an amino acid, whatever it was, right? But it was something that was not compatible with the life forms that were on the generation ship. And so a pandemic sweeps through and it wipes a bunch of people out. And then what happens is the people that are left kind of devolve into these like primitive tribes where they start to forget that they're on a ship and like how to operate it. And the ship's just kind of like free floating in space. And a lot of people that living there aren't even aware that they're on a starship anymore because so much time has gone by, generations and generations and generations of people. And so then, the story ends. I don't want to spoil it if you're going to read it, but they have to kind of figure out what's going on. Okay. So that's part of it. Now, interestingly, there is another story by Robert Heinlein, originally published in 2 parts in like pulp magazines in 1941, I believe it was. And then they were later combined into a book called Orphans of the Sky that was published in 1963. But again, the original ones came out in 1941. And this is a generation ship called the Generation Ship Vanguard. And basically, it's a very, very similar premise. So one of the interesting things that happens in Orphans in the Sky is that there is a 2-headed character named Joe Jim, something like that. His name escapes me right now, but he's kind of one of the main characters of the book. And he has 2 heads, and the 2 heads have completely different personalities, but they're on the same body. That's going to be important later as we look at some of the creatures in Metamorphosis Alpha. But James Ward kind of says, like, no, Orphans in the Sky wasn't really like he was aware of it, but like Starship by Brian Aldiss, that was his main inspiration. Now, a lot of people have also pointed out that there was a TV show. It was a combined United States Canada production from 1973 called Star Lost. And the premise of that is, again, very similar. It's this idea that there's people and animals and creatures and stuff living on one of these generation ships that kind of like things go awry and it gets lost. And so 1973, that was out. and this comes out in 1976. So a lot of people have mentioned that, although I believe James Ward has said that either he wasn't aware of it at all, or if he wasn't, like, it just wasn't an influence. It wasn't, he was really more of a reader, more of a science fiction reader. So those are some of the influences that kind of went into making this game the way it is. So we've talked about the influences and a little bit about the mechanics, but let's dive in a little bit more here. And the reason I'm spending so much time on Metamorphosis Alpha is because Gamma World derives directly from this game, and a lot of the concepts that are introduced in Gamma World actually started here in Metamorphosis Alpha. Also, this is very, very rare. So one of the things that's interesting is TSR publishes a lot of role-playing games, but there's just a ton, and we're going to talk about a few of those. But Boot Hill from 75, Empire the Petal Throne from 75, this from 76, they don't actually get any support. They don't get any supplemental materials. Now, later, Boot Hill will get another edition, and they start to publish adventures for that, but that's not going to happen until 1979. So by the time this comes out, and then this comes out in 78, okay, so TSR is publishing stuff, but they're not really supporting them because they're really putting most of their effort at this point into Dungeons and Dragons because that's selling very, very well. Now, my understanding is that this game also sold well. It depends on the kind of terminology you want to use. It's either the first science fantasy role-playing game, which it definitely is. It also, some people would say it's the first science fiction role-playing game, although this is not hard science fiction. So it's not like Traveller. Traveller is definitely in science fiction. This is really more science fantasy. Okay, so at the beginning, it does give you this little section here on suggested additional equipment that you might need for the game. So you need some kind of random number generator, and it talks about how you can use chits or things like that, or you can use dice, graph paper, hexagon paper, sheet protectors, notebooks, pencils and paper, imagination, one very patient referee, and players, the more the merrier. So really, as you go through this, again, just talking about how things are presented, you've got this in-world or in-game fiction, whatever you want to call it, for the introduction, with a description of this disaster that happened. And then, it's a game of survival. And then it does tell you finally that this is a game. Because, again, the way this is presented, it does say in the front, fantastic role-playing game of science fiction adventures. But there's really no, again, like, kind of letting people know what they're getting into, I guess. It just kind of jumps right into it. But then, rather than talk about how to make characters or anything like that, it gets into how do you create the starship that you're going to be on. Now, James called the starship Warden. And he says later on, he did that because his last name is Ward. So we've talked about this before, but if you know the spell, like Drawmidge is instant summons from Dungeons and Dragons. So Drawmidge is James Ward's character, and that's James Ward's name backwards. Okay. So back at the dawn of the hobby, they were very, very big on naming things after other people that, after the people that were creating the things. Right. So there are like countries and nations and cultures in like the world of Greyhawk that Gary named after people. Like Perrinland is named after Jeff Perrin, who was Gary Gygax's co-creator of the game Chainmail back in 1971. So that's where Perrinland comes from. So anyway, James called it the Starship Warden after his name Ward. And in what he said is that he always thought people were just going to name the spaceships after themselves, the starship after themselves. But everybody called their ship the Warden because it's in the rules here. So I guess it's sort of like, if you play Dungeons and Dragons before they started publishing campaign settings, you sort of would make your own world. Maybe you'd borrow one from fiction, like, Middle Earth or, Hyboria from Conan or whatever. But then once the campaign worlds start coming out, people start using those campaign worlds. Well, the Starship Warden kind of got associated as being the campaign world for Metamorphosis Alpha. So, and James always said he just thought that was funny because that, according to him, that was not his intent. But he has all these descriptions here on creating the Warden and what's on the different levels. And then he jumps into like all this equipment that you can get. So again, it's just really funny because, like, in a modern game, you would think like, here's a short example of how to play. Here's this equipment you need, which he does go over, like the dice and things like that. he doesn't tell you the when he talks about the dice, he doesn't get into the nomenclature of like calling it a D something and like what it means if you says D, D6 plus 3. He doesn't ever tell you what that means. He just says you might need dice. And then he goes over again this ship, and then he goes over the equipment, but there's nothing in here about who's using this equipment. Like, how do you use it? That's not explained yet, right? So here we are already on page 6, and we don't know yet how to start playing. We just have a list of equipment. Okay, and you have all this kind of stuff, and you've got starship equipment, which is different from ship devices and units, even though this is still equipment. So you have that, and then you have the weapon systems. Okay, and that's all described here. And this gets pretty complicated. I think it's a little bit more complicated than it needs to be, but the idea is that you're rolling a number of dice, and it's 6-sided dice. And so you roll 3 6-sided dice, and then the graph shows you based on what kind of armor the person has and whether you've done short, medium, or long in terms of like your penetration level, then how much damage you're going to do. It's like, it took me a while to read this over and over again to finally get it. I get it now, but it was, it's interesting that you're doing that when later on, when you're attacking with other weapons, like, the more primitive weapons, that's your kind of standard, like D20 kind of thing. But anyway, okay. So then you get beginning the game and developing characters on page 9. Okay, so this is where it goes over the different ability scores. We kind of briefly already talked about that. And then you've got your different radiation intensity levels. So these are very much like your saving throw tables that you would see in Dungeons and Dragons pre-3rd edition, when, 3rd edition changed everything to just, D20 roll high. But in older editions, you had tables for saving throws. Every character had a different type of save. In this game, they're all the same because there's no classes. And then you've got your constitution, and then you use that to avoid poison. And so there's your poison chart, which again, this is like a saving throw. Okay. So, and then it gives you example characters. So example of a beginning player character of the human type. And see here, we're going to get into some of that naming. So you see this guy's name is Scarlock. Okay. And he's got his scores here generated by rolling 3d6. Now in this particular game, there's no level advancement. So you don't get better over time, except from finding equipment. That's how you, like specifically like relics and like ancient, what they would call ancient, but like laser pistols and bombs and computers and things like that. That's how you improve your character over time, by finding those things. You never get better as far as like your ability scores are never going to change. And so your hit points are rolled based on what your constitution score is. This guy's constitution score is 9. So at starting out, he would roll 96, and it tells you that here. And that's his starting hit points. And then that's it. That's all he's ever going to have. He's going to get lower when he gets hurt, and then you're going to heal. But there's no level advancement. There's no experience point system in this game at all. It's just that was probably the biggest difference from Dungeons and Dragons, is this idea that characters in here improve by gathering equipment, not by gaining experience points. Okay, so you had Scarlock the human, and then you have the mutated humanoid whose name is Lock Scar. Okay, and then you have a mutated creature whose name is Rax Cole, which is, of course, Lock Scar backwards. So, again, very typical of the time. Now, you see that the mutated human and the mutated creature have mutations, both physical and mental. So, this is probably the coolest thing from this game, the coolest thing that they added to the game that makes it creative, is this idea that these mutant creatures or mutant humans roll on these tables to figure out what kind of mutations they have. So it's very X-Men like. So in here, mutations or radiation, it can kill you, but if it doesn't kill you, it's going to give you a mutation, which could be beneficial or it could be a defect. And it's all based on dice. There's no points that you put into it. Things like that. Like you just roll the dice and you get what you get. And as my daughter used to say, you don't get upset. So you might really want to wish that you had radiated eyes, but instead you roll and you get light generation, or you roll and you get new body parts, or shorter. or whatever, right? So those are things, and then this explains all the mutations. So this is something that you can take right out of this game, these mutation tables, and put into a game of D&D. And depending on what version of D&D you're playing, you might need to like change the mechanics a little bit of how they work. But for the most part, the idea of having a table that you can use to add different abilities to your monsters as well as a DM helps things from keep them from getting boring. I'm going to show you an example of that as we get to the end of the video here, but later. But anyway, these are your explanations of all of your mutations. And then he goes through, here's some fun art with a human leader with a security robot and 3 mutated humans. All right. And so then you have your explanation of your plant mutations. Now, in this particular version of the game, you can't play a mutated plant, I don't believe. I think those were reserved for NPCs. I know they were in Gamma World until later editions. It might be, I forgot to check that before we got on the video here. But then it goes through your mutants and it talks about all these different kinds. So he's giving you examples, and these are basically mutated creatures. So you've got alligators and black bears and badgers and bobcats and cougars. He's very big on calling things oids, cougaroids, and bearoid. And I think there's wolfoids at a certain point. Yep, there we go. So creatures that are sort of based on North American animal types, okay? And then you've got your flying type creatures, your hawkoids, of course, and then you've got your insects, and then you've got your plants, and then you've got your mutated human types, and he gives you some examples here. So 1, 2, 3, and 4 doesn't give them names. He just kind of says, like, here's an example of a mutated human. So that's basically the game. You've got your weapons and combat here, and then you've got your treasure items, which are fun, right? So this is another thing that you just would roll, and it would tell you what you find: solar cells or chemical cells, disruptor pistols, paralysis darts, and then these color bands, which are used to move between the levels on the ship. Okay, so you would wave it in front of the door, and it's going to the elevator, and it's going to take you up and down, or open doors and things like that. So those are kind of fun. And then it gets into encounter tables for different areas on the ship. Now, the idea of the ship was that it had different environments because it was moving creatures from Earth to wherever they were going to settle, to wherever they're going to colonize. So you had like swamp areas and forest areas and mountain areas and lakes and things like that, all stocked with creatures that would be naturally found in those areas. And then, of course, they've all been mutated. Okay, so that's why he has these tables like this. So each level, it was like a different environment. And that was part of the fun of the exploration, is kind of not knowing what environment you're going to end up with. And when you played this, a lot of times you could play not necessarily knowing that you're on a starship. So if the referee wanted to run this game that way, you would just be part of a primitive tribe, and you might be careful about the language you use as far as like mutants and things like that. You might just say like, oh, you have abilities that this person doesn't. And you could run this as a straight game with the players perhaps not necessarily understanding that they are on a starship until you get further into the game if you've been playing for a long time. And then they might start to find things that give them clues. But the idea also is that the way that you explain things as far as the technology, you don't tell them you found a computer. You describe like, oh, you found a box and it looks like it's made from metal and it's got some glowing things on. And if you describe it the right way, the players might not necessarily understand what that is. And then they have to figure out how to use that. And that's another part of this game, is like figuring out how to use this equipment that you come across. So then it gives you an example in here of moderating the game. It talks about the means of exchange as far as like money and things like that. And then this is the city level of the starship. So there was a city level, and he's drawing maps in here. And then you've got your credits here. James Ward. Now, Brian Bloom helped on the development. We've talked about him before. Editing is by Mike Carr and David Sutherland. We've talked about both of them before. And then all the artwork in here is by David Sutherland. I think it's David Sutherland III, if I remember correctly. But that's all in here. Okay. So I did mention that, that they didn't support this game with, there's no adventures written for this. There's no supplements. There's nothing. Where it was supported was in Strategic Review and in Dragon Magazine. So we have gone over Dragon Magazine Volume 1 before. This is Best of Dragon Volume 1. But there are some articles in here, quite a few actually, that are specifically for Metamorphosis Alpha. However, I used them for Gamma World. So how green was my mutant? The appearance of humanoids in Metamorphosis Alpha. So this is written by Gary Gygax. But this was a way of describing your mutant, because they were saying, well, if you're mutant, it's not just that like you might have wings and like a tail and, like, or maybe scales or things like that. But like everything could be different. Like your skin and hair color could be different. Different color patterns. Your head could be completely different. Your neck, your body. So it was helping you kind of expand the definition of what a mutant might look like, which I thought was really fun. And again, I use that a lot in my Gamma World game. So here's some different humanoids that are all mutants, right? So these were all at one point in their ancestry human, and they've just been mutated to look like this now. All right. And then here's an article by James Ward, the creator of the game, who adds some things to the game where he's saying, oh, this is some ideas that, weren't included for whatever reason. And then this gentleman here, Guy W. Miclemore Jr., hopefully I'm pronouncing his name correctly, he writes an alternate beginning sequence. So this was really fun. There's like a clone bank, and you see all the clones here. And so he writes this whole article on basically playing Metamorphosis Alpha, but with a different premise than the one that was in the original game. All right, so that's how they supported Metamorphosis Alpha. Okay, so we finished with Metamorphosis Alpha, and again, thanks for sticking through that. I know it was a little long, but I did feel it was important to talk about that game, because of how much it did influence the game that we're going to talk about next, which is Gamma World. So, why did TSR change from Metamorphosis Alpha to Gamma World? So, again, Gamma World is going to come out in 1978. Metamorphosis Alpha came out in 1976. So, one of the reasons is, again, I think that if you look at Metamorphosis Alpha, it is this self-contained dungeon, but it's one dungeon. So if the referee plans it out, you can play there for a very long time because the ship is so big. Again, the example one in the book, I think it's either 17 or 18 levels. But you could explore all that. But if you explore all the way through that and you figure out that you're on a starship and you find the control room and you're able to get the controls back up and running to where you can maneuver the ship to where it needs to go, and say you go and take it to the world that you were originally trying to colonize, and that's how you wanted to end the game, like you could be done. And then, well, what are you going to do? Are you going to play again? Like it's sort of like you've figured out how to go through and explore everything that could be explored in that ship. So again, that could take forever, depending on the kind of adventures that you want to come up with. But it is a self-contained dungeon in space, and so moving it from a dungeon setting to a world setting, which is what Gamma World is going to do, really opens up the opportunities of things that you can have. Another thing that I think to me was a huge part of Gamma World's allure was the idea that you were exploring the ruins of an area that you probably had already seen, like, around your hometown. So a lot of people, what they did was they explored, like if you lived in Pittsburgh, you explored a post-apocalyptic Pittsburgh, so that you would come across places where you would kind of recognize, like, oh, that was the shopping mall. That's what's there. Like we might be able to find supplies in there if, it hasn't been ransacked yet, or, just different things like that. And I think that's part of the fun, is like being able to recognize these ruins, these structures as actual places, and then what's happened to them since. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second with regard to a post-apocalyptic TV show that came out after Gamma World. But to me, it really is Gamma World brought to the screen. But in any event, I think that was one of the key benefits, and it opened up a lot more opportunities. So later on, Gary Gygax was actually quoted a few different times as basically saying, like, even though he helped work on this game, he contributed a bunch of ideas to it. He felt that the core of the game was really at its best when it was on the spaceship, when he preferred the setting of Metamorphosis Alpha, and he felt that the game kind of lost its uniqueness when it became the Gamma world that we all know today. All right. But, again, I think that there was a reason to do that. So it's called Gamma World. It really is focused on North America, and that is made very clear when you look at the map. So it's not all going to fit. Sorry about that. But this is the map for Gamma World that came in the box set. So it is a hex map, as you see. But this is essentially what you have here is post-apocalyptic North America. All right. So this is, because the game was published in North America, this is kind of where they were intending you to play, was in this North American setting. So it could easily be played anywhere. It could be in Europe or Africa or Asia or wherever. But, the idea in here was that, they were focusing more on North America. So we need to talk a little bit about the influence of this game, because they're different from Metamorphosis Alpha. Even though mechanically a lot of the ideas are going to be the same here, you're going to have the same three character types: pure strain humans, and mutant animals. Those are your classes and your races, or whatever you want to call them. That's what you can play in this game, just like in Metamorphosis Alpha. There are mutation tables that you roll randomly, just like in Metamorphosis Alpha. So a lot of the mechanics are going to be similar. However, the inspirations for the game are different. So these are just a few. There's a lot, and they actually talk about them in the introduction here. So first off, this cover art by David Trampier. I love it. So this is obviously the color version, and then it's repeated in black and white on this one. So what's interesting, I love these, very futuristic guys, and they're pointing to this, like these ruins of the city. And I'm guessing this is a radiation, tracker thing to count that. But I really like this. Now, what's interesting is that the game is written doesn't necessarily, it's not that you can't play this way, but it's not written to play this. This makes it look very serious, very like, you're exploring these areas with this group of people that all have all this fancy equipment. They're all wearing pretty much the same thing. They've all got the same helmets with these fancy goggles, and they've got all this equipment and these weapons. And then they're going to explore this area. All these people look human. But I was very struck by this. So that's the art. Okay. So then when you get into the foreword here, this is written by Tom Wham. Now, Tom Wham and Timothy Jones. I'm going to focus on Tom Wham. So he worked at Guidon Games originally, which is the company that had originally published Chainmail. And he eventually starts to work at TSR in a variety of different capacities. But one of the main things that he's known for was designing games that were printed in Dragon magazine and then doing the illustrations for those games. So these weren't role-playing games. They were like board games, for lack of a better word, that were inserted in the middle of the magazine. So there was things like Snit Smashing, and then the follow-up, which was called Snit's Revenge, which was actually much more popular than the first one, and the Awful Green Things from Outer Space. So these were all games that were published in Dragon magazine. And and he did the illustrations for them, but he also worked on other games. So he's one of the people that helped to edit this particular game. If I remember correctly, that was sort of his role in this particular one. But he writes this foreword, and he talks about, basically the genre of post-apocalyptic fiction. And, the end of the world has fascinated religious men for millennia. So it's a very evocative forward, but he talks about the setting, and then he says that again you can simply integrate these rules with the advanced Dungeons and Dragons rules, as they were edited with that in mind. So this game is trying to be closer to the current version of the Dungeons and Dragons rules, and they're doing that very specifically because I think they knew that if they could get people switching between the two games, that's just going to expand their user base. And it's much easier to learn a new game if you already know the rules. So you're essentially, if you already knew how to play Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, Gamma World is really mostly just going to be a setting difference as opposed to a mechanical rules difference. Okay, so it was made with that in mind. And then he talks about that. and talks a little bit about some of the influences of the game. Okay, so that's that. And then you have your introduction here. But where does this game sort of like, what are the inspirations? Well, one of the main ones that James Ward quotes is Hero's Journey. So this is a book that was originally published in 1973 and by Sterling Lanier, I believe it was. Yes. Now, it was originally intended to be part of a trilogy. I have the first two books, and the reason I only have the first two is because the third book was never published in the trilogy, unfortunately, and then Sterling Lanier died and never finished it. So, but this is a post-apocalyptic story that takes place like in the year, I don't know, 3500 AD, something like that. Mostly takes place in Canada, which is where the main character is from. And what's really interesting in this one that I loved is that it has this glossary where it describes all these different things. There's some very interesting cultures in this book and nations and factions and things like that that you don't get in typical post-apocalyptic stuff, at least game-wise. So you have all these different things. And I love the glossary alone was very intriguing to me. But this is Hero's Journey 1973. Now, interestingly enough, this book is also mentioned in the 1979 Dungeon Master's Guide in Appendix N. We've talked about Appendix N before, the inspirational educational reading. But if you see the inspired reading here, inspirational reading, you see right there, Hero's Journey by Sterling Lanier. So that's because a huge part of this book actually takes place exploring an underground area, okay, like an underground cavern system. It's just in a post-apocalyptic setting. Also, I don't know that this is where this idea came from, but because Gary mentions this as an inspirational source, there is a monster in this book that is very similar to the green slime, almost identical. And so I always thought that that's where maybe the idea had come from. But also when you think about it, much of D&D, the way it's described, can be thought of as a post-apocalyptic setting. So I know a few people have talked about this theory. It's not unique to me, but you're exploring these areas where there are ruins that you're going into of prior civilizations. So something happened for all these dungeons and all of these like tombs and ruined, cities and stuff that you can go explore. Something happened for those things to go away. And so if you think about it, D&D can be thought of as sort of a post-apocalyptic type of setting. It's just not post-nuclear holocaust, but it could be, anything, all right? So this is an inspirational book for two different games, Gamma World and Dungeons and Dragons. Highly recommend it if you can find this to read it, okay? So another one, Canticle for Leibowitz. This is 1959, I think it is. So this is by Walter M. Miller. And this one's interesting because it focuses on sort of like this resurgent Catholic Church in a post-apocalyptic era and what their role is in helping to rebuild society. So you can see the artwork here. So, and they've had to change. They've had to adapt to a new world. And so this one is sort of about like society building in, again, like, starting from scratch in a post-apocalyptic world. So great book. As you see here, a classical bestseller and a landmark of 20th century literature. All right. And then another one, this isn't really quoted as being a source, but I always used it in my games as an inspiration, is the Horse Clan series by Robert Adams. So you see here, this guy's got this, what looks like a saber-toothed tiger. They explain in the book why it's a saber-toothed tiger. This is a post-apocalyptic story, and it's a series. There are, I want to say dozens, but there's at least a dozen. I'm sure there are more books. I haven't read all of them. And I actually started with the second book first. I saw it at a spinner rack, and I grabbed it. I hate to say basically because of the cover, not just the art, but when I read the description that was post-apocalyptic, I was instantly hooked. So these are really fun stories. Now, what happens is as time goes on, and I told you it's a long series, the author starts to bring in a lot of like some weird kinky sex stuff. And so if you're not really into that, just, I guess don't read all the way through the series. There is some, definitely not for kids. There's some definite, there's some child, I want to say abuse. There's like child slaves in these books, because he's just talking about the societies and like what would happen, and like, people are attacking each other. It's very violent, and so there's a lot of stuff in here that is definitely not for kids, but it is interesting world building as far as like cultures that might develop in a post-apocalyptic society. All right, so that's this. Now, I'm going to talk about some of these other ones later. Well, we can talk about actually Commandy right now. So other sources, Planet of the Apes had come out in the 60s. And that is a post-apocalyptic type of setting. And Planet of the Apes inspired Commandy, The Last Boy on Earth, by Jack Kirby. And it inspired it because originally DC Comics wanted to publish the Planet of the Apes comic book series, but Marvel got the license first. And so DC wanted to jump on this idea of these like humanoid animals. And so they hired Jack Kirby and said, can you create your version of Planet of the Apes? That's why Commandy got created. So if you're not familiar with Commandy, this is the cover of the first issue. So Commandy is a boy that was living in sort of like one of these bunkers during a nuclear holocaust. He's living in there with his grandfather. And so he's never seen the regular world apocalypse, and his grandfather dies, and he ends up leaving this bunker, and the bunker that he was in was Command Bunker D, or Command D, and that's why his name is Commandy. So it's goofy, but it makes sense within the context of the story. But this book has a ton of these like animal mutant types. They're all over the place, and the humans are sort of like they are treated like the animals, like how we would treat animals today. They're the second class citizens that don't have any rights and things like that. Very, very Planet of the Apes like. But it's Jack Kirby, so he takes it in a totally different direction. So here's your fun map. This is just one of them. They publish other maps later on, but you've got your lion tribes, which eventually becomes the United States of Lions. You've got the expanding tiger empire. You've got your gorilla communes. Also in Australia, you have like the Kangaroo Murder Society. Really fun, evocative names, but very, whether James Ward was familiar with these comics or not, these came out in the early mid 70s. As someone who plays Game World, this is something that you could use to help inspire your games. Okay. And I'll just talk about Thundar now. So Thundar, this is why I got interested in Gamma World, was this cartoon. So originally came out, aired in 1980 and 1981, and then it was rerun 2 years later on a completely different network. So I think it was originally on ABC, and then it moved to NBC in 1983. I think I probably saw it in 1983. But anyway, Thunder the Barbarian, most of you, I think, if you're an old timer like me, you know what this is. But if you're new and you've never heard of it before, this takes place in a post-apocalyptic world. In this world, the apocalypse was caused by a runaway planet flying between the Earth and the moon, and it throws the moon out of orbit and it cracks it in half. So, and very famously, what you see in the introduction every week of this cartoon is you can see the cracked moon, like the two halves, like floating there in space, but for whatever reason, doing that means that we live in this future where you've got like these mutant guys. This is Ukla the Mock, and so there's societies of people like this, like that have like these sort of humanoid mutant animal creatures, very Island of Dr. Moreau like, and then there's also magic. So you see this is Princess Ariel, and she's casting some spells here. So for whatever reason, magic becomes a thing. So they call it a world of savagery, science, and super sorcery, I think was the tagline of the show. So there's a lot of wizards in this game. They're all evil except her. She's the only one that's good, but very, very pulpy, very Conan like that, right? Where you have the magic users, the bad guys. Okay, so if this art looks at all the designs of the people, that's because this wasn't created by Jack Kirby, but Jack Kirby ended up working on a lot of designs for this, along with Alex Toth, very famous comic book artist. Also, Alex Toth is the guy who worked on a lot of the Hanna-Barbera cartoons in the 70s, worked on Super Friends, and a lot of those. So, these designs are kind of a combination of their two sort of, creative ideas. All right. So that's why I got into Game World, why I picked it up. This is the second role-playing game I ever played. And it was one of the first I also ever owned. A friend, this is not my original set. My original box set's completely janky, but a friend sold me his for $1. The box tape, it's got like electrical tape on the side. The book was missing most of the pages at the end and things like that. So I finally got a newer copy, and you can see this one's in pretty decent shape. But anyway, let's talk about the mechanics from this. So again, very similar to Metamorphosis Alpha. What's different is that you have your ability scores. So you have Constitution and Dexterity, you have Charisma, you have Intelligence, and then instead of Wisdom, you have Mental Strength, and instead of Strength, you have Physical Strength. But that's just here nor there. It's basically, that's your Strength and your Wisdom, but they called it Physical Strength and Mental Strength. Now, interestingly, if we see the suggested additional equipment here, you see that you can you're going to need graph paper, hexagon paper, sheet protectors, notebooks, pencils and paper, imagination, a very patient referee, and players the more the merrier. I think you guys probably have seen that before because I just showed it. This is lifted pretty much word for word right out of Metamorphosis Alpha. Okay, so this tells you how to design your Gamma world, all right, with your cities and your villages, your tribes, your bands, your ancient areas, mech farms, robot farms, tombs of the ancients, ancient towns, ancient cities, ancient metropolis, fortifications, all that kind of stuff. And then you get into creating your character. You've got your character types here. We already talked about that. Okay. Your mutant animals, and then your ability scores, which are rolled with a 3d6. So your score is going to run from 3 to 18. Okay. And then you've got your hopeless characters. So this one always cracked me up. Although, well, I appreciate the art. I love the shading. I always love the ink work. I'm going to say this is Trampier again. I'm pretty sure this is Dave Trampier. So I always love his art. This to me was much more evocative of the style of game I wanted to play. This made it seem like I was playing a goofy, silly kid game. And so I didn't like it. There's another one in here that's getting the same thing. So again, it's a well executed drawing. It's just not my style of the kind of game that I wanted to play. Okay, but you've got your list of mutations here broken up into physical and mental. Okay. And that takes up a pretty big portion of this book. And then you get into your creatures. These are the famous hoops. So, James, were very funny. So you've got your hoops in here. These are mutated rabbits, obviously. One of their abilities that they have is that when they touch metal, the metal turns to rubber. Perhaps you've seen a cartoon like that starring Bugs Bunny. That's where that idea comes from. A lot of people go like, I don't understand why they have that ability. James is drawing on a lot of different inspirations and from his life. And it's funny. It's funny to have that in the game. It adds a little bit of lightheartedness to what can be a pretty heavy subject, a post-nuclear holocaust. It's not really a fun world to think about. So having some little funny things in it is kind of helps to take some of the edge off. Okay. But, they have that ability. So the other thing that's interesting about that, it's not explained. There's no mechanics. There's no die rolling. There's no save. It's like they touch the metal. It turns to rubber. They're the only creatures in the whole game that can do that. A player cannot get that ability. And this game is very much like that. There are things that, in modern day design terms, you would say don't make sense or aren't fair or whatever you want to say. I don't say that, but a lot of people would say that. This game is very much building the idea that there's things that just don't make sense, and it's up to the referee to adjudicate how that works, and the players will go along with it because they trust their referee. All right. So here you've got your descriptions of all your different creatures. Okay. So these are basically, for the most part, plants or animals that have been mutated, and then they just have new names. So you'll see some of these repeating from Metamorphosis Alpha, like the Hisser, which is the in Metamorphosis Alpha, I'm pretty sure it was an alligator, but this says it's a half man, half snake. But there you've got your hoops. So a mutation peculiar to the hoops is their ability to transmute metal objects into rubber. So there you go. So then you have all of those. Got some more fun art here. And then you get into your artifacts. You've got your radiation matrix. So again, mechanically, it's very similar to Metamorphosis Alpha. This is the fun one. So this is figuring out, it's using flowcharts so to determine if your character can figure out what these items do when they come across it. So this is like your one for if you've got pistols, rifles, energy weapons, grenades, bombs, whatever. If your character comes across one of these, you use these flowcharts and you roll dice to figure out if your character can determine what the function of the device is and how to use it. And each type of device has a different flow chart. Okay. It's a really interesting system for figuring that out, and it makes it kind of fun. It's like a game within a game, right? Because you come across these devices, and you're not supposed to know what an energy rifle looks like or how it's used, because your character is growing up in a world where they don't know what that is. They're growing up in a world where, as it describes in here, the crossbow is the ultimate weapon. So coming across a ray gun is something that you can do, but it's not something that you would necessarily set out to do, because you don't even know that thing exists until you come across it. And then through trial and error and using that chart, you have to figure out what it does. Okay, so then it gives you've got power armor in here, which is really fun. Really like the power armor. It talks a little bit about, healing and things like that. Languages, robots, now experience. Like Metamorphosis Alpha, this doesn't have a leveling system per se, but it does talk about experience points and how you get experience points. And it comes from killing creatures, finding artifacts. Those are the two main ones. And the value of the experience that you get from finding artifacts is the gold piece value of that artifact. The value for killing creatures is basically its hit point value. Okay, so very similar to Metamorphosis Alpha, the hit points in this game for a character are determined by taking a number of 6-sided dice equal to your Constitution score, rolling them at character creation, adding them up, and that's the hit points that you're going to have for the rest of the time you play the game. Okay, so you start out with very high level of hit points because there are things in here that just do a ton of damage and a lot of times you can't escape. So certain of the ray guns, and there's things like vibro swords, and things like, they don't do a dice, like you don't roll dice for damage. They just do a flat amount of damage. Sometimes it's like 30 points or 50 points. So starting with high levels of hit points was kind of necessary in order to survive in this game. All right, but it goes on to talk about experience points. And then what happens is once you hit a certain level, and it has this amounts here that you gain, you basically roll on this table and you figure out what's going to happen. So on a 1 through 6, one of your ability scores is going to go up. Once you hit 18, that score can no longer go up. So that's a wasted roll. If your intelligence is 18 and you roll a 6 to increase your intelligence, you've wasted your experience points at that level because you can't get that. And then you can get additional things. You can get a point to hit a roll in physical combat, or an extra point of damage inflicted by non-energy weapons. Okay, so then it gives you an example of play. Okay, and then it has these, example of a referee moderating adventure. You've got some more fun art here. You've got some credits. We've already talked about most of these people before. Okay. And then you have your matrices for your attacks and things like that. Now, one of the things that is in here that's really fun are, there's these encounter tables, but there's these treasure tables that are in here of like what you can find, the treasure list. So ballpoint pen, good condition, lamp, fair condition, slot machine, excellent condition, electric fan. So they're really fun. Now, some of them get really goofy. Sorry that this is going in and out of focus. But there's some things in here where, if I remember correctly, you can find like the Best of Dragon Volume 53, which I thought was really funny. Okay, a few other things to talk about with Gamma World, and I also want to apologize really quick. So I live in Southern California. If you've been watching the news lately, I'm recording this on February 6th, 2024. We've just been hammered by rain. So I know people make fun of us because we do kind of tend to overcompensate when it rains, but it's just been raining nonstop since Sunday. It's now Tuesday. It like literally hasn't stopped for a few days, and our infrastructure here just isn't built to handle that. So my point of all this is that I tried to film this when it wasn't raining. There was a break for like a few minutes, and then it started again. So if you do hear rain in this, I apologize. I'll try to clean it up in editing, but I wanted to talk about a couple more things from this rule book. So one of the things that I loved about this game, and I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's very long, but it's the introduction where it talks about basically what happened. Like why is Gamma World taking place in a post-apocalyptic setting? And the gist of it is that one thing that's really fun is that this takes place in the future, and it's a science fiction future. So obviously that's why you can find things like ray guns and vibro swords and fancy vehicles and powered armor and things like that. And it's because the premise of Gamworld is that the apocalypse happened during like a time period of science fiction type discovery. So, so that's part of it. So I think I want to say it was the year, they say 2471, I believe. But in whatever event, there's all these different groups and they're all fighting against each other, like different nations and things like that. And so this group during the shadow years calls itself the Apocalypse. And they basically announce that, like, hey, if you don't stop fighting, we're going to nuke every capital city everywhere. And the people don't stop fighting. And so the Apocalypse basically does that. And it turns all these cities into like radioactive slag, I believe is the term that they use. So, and it says like they don't know who the Apocalypse was, like what the group was, or, you know, who they were or where they got all these weapons. But basically, they civilization had been slashed, burned, crushed, and scattered to the four winds. And that's the world that the characters are growing up in. Apologies for that. There's a motorcycle going up the street. I just can't catch a break today with recording. But anyway, so now, so it says the year's 2471, you see here. And so that was kind of a unique part of this game. But as a kid growing up during the Cold War, where this threat of nuclear obliteration kind of was like always hanging over our heads, it was always being talked about on the news. And, you know, we'd already been through the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was before I was born. But the idea that, you know, countries were going to launch nuclear weapons, it didn't seem like it was a matter of if, it seemed like it was a matter of like when. And so, like this, it really struck me as a kid to read that. It's quite evocative, but it's very depressing and a little scary. But anyway, so that was it. And then another fun thing that I really liked in this book is this concept called cryptic alliances. So these are basically your factions, and they have different groups with very fun names. There's the Brotherhood of Thought. There's the Seekers, a group of humans and mutants that all appear completely human, and they consider mutated animals to be inferior, and they're searching for. Then you have the Knights of Genetic Purity, which are pure strain humans that are trying to destroy all mutated humans because they feel that they're unworthy. And then you've got the Friends of Entropy or the Red Death. These are like your kind of punk sort of biker types. So again, I don't know that this was influenced by it, but the movie The Road Warrior, like those bad guys in that movie always reminded me of the Friends of Entropy. Then you've got the Iron Society and the Supremacists, the Healers, the Restorationists, the Followers of the Voice, the Ranks of the Fit was kind of a fun one. The Archivists, the Radioactivists, the Created. Okay, and so these are all like different factions, and the player characters can align themselves with some of those factions if they want, and then like that gives the referee an excuse to like send them on missions or whatever. Otherwise, you're kind of just exploring, which is also just fine. Okay, so really fun game. And one other thing I forgot to mention when I started talking about this was another influence to the game, which was a book by Andre Norton called Starman's Son. I think it was originally called Daybreak 2250, and then they changed it to Starman's Son, or I might have that reversed, but in any event, it's the same book. And that book is about a character named Fours, I believe it is, and he is traveling through a radioactive wasteland looking for artifacts and relics of the ancients, they call them, and he's traveling with like his mutated cat. It is Gamworld to a T. And so like when I finally read that book, I read that book after I had discovered Gamworld. It was very clear to me that was probably a huge inspiration to James Ward as far as like how he designed the world of Gamworld. So that book came out in, I want to say 1952. Okay, so there's Gamworld. And then, so the box set came with dice. These dice were in here when I bought this. So again, I told you this was not my original copy. My original copy came from a friend and it was all beat up and most of the stuff was missing. This box came with just 2 dice, and as you see, they've been colored in with a crayon. I did talk about that before in one of my other videos, but these dice originally, those numbers wouldn't have been colored in. And so they gave you a crayon so that you could read them easier. I never colored in my dice for my game. That mine came with the 1981 basic set, Moldavate base set. Anyway, the person I bought this from off eBay said that these dice were in here, but these wouldn't have been the full set of dice. It would have been a full set, right? So this is just what was left. You saw the map, which has never been used, but the idea for the hex map, again, if you're not used to this, would be used for a hex crawl. And it's giant because it's continent sized. But the idea is that the referee would put different, would have a key to know that this hex corresponds to, usually what you'd have is numbers and letters. So you'd have numbers across the top and letters down the side, or vice versa. Numbers across the top as columns and then letters down the side as rows. And you'd say, okay, the hex that's in, F12 or whatever it is this one. And then the referee would have a keyed thing that would say what's in that hex. And then the players would say, we're going to go to that hex. And then they would travel to get there. And then the referee's looking at all the other hexes to see what's in between, what's going on, and what encounters happen in those. So that's kind of how that was designed. That's on a very large scale. And then you would have, other hex maps for, your more individual adventure scales. All right. Hopefully I explained that. Okay. These are some of the adventures that were published for first edition Gamma World. So first is Legion of Gold. I talked about this briefly a few times ago. And then that's by Gary Gygax with his son Luke, and then Paul Rice III. And then Famine and Fargo by Michael Price. So you can see here, this is Bill Willingham art, comic book artist Bill Willingham. And then this art here, I forget who did this one. This might be Jim Holloway, just looking at the style. But in any event, this one is much goofier. So you're basically at a ruined ancient chicken processing plant, which is why there's this mutant chicken here. Not one of my favorites, just to be quite honest. Love the art, not one of my favorite adventures. So this one's a classic, Legion of Gold. Okay, so that's Gamma World. Now, Gamma World inspired a bunch of other games, but really quickly, we're going to talk about this adventure that came out in 1980. So I have talked about this one before as well. See my video on mixing science fiction and fantasy in Dungeons & Dragons. But this is Expedition to the Berry Peaks Dungeon Module S3. S stands for Special, and by Gary Gygax. So this is originally run at Origins 2. And the idea that Gary was looking at was, well, basically what they were trying to do was when they ran it, and I believe it was 76, Gary wanted to introduce people to the game of Metamorphosis Alpha. So he says it was begun in early 76 when TSR was contemplating publication of a science fantasy role-playing game. Jim Ward had already shown us some rough notes on Metamorphosis Alpha, and I thought it would be a splendid idea to introduce Jim's game of Origins 2 and introduce the concept to D&D players by means of a tournament scenario. So he laid out the scenario from the old Greyhawk Castle campaign, blah, blah, blah. So he just goes on. So we did talk about this before, and hopefully I'm not spoiling it if you've not played this, but the point of this adventure is that the characters are on a spaceship and they don't know. I mean, they go to explore a crashed spaceship in Greyhawk. They're sent there as a mission, and the crashed spaceship, they don't have context for a crashed spaceship. So they think it's a cave, and then they discover it's made of metal. And it's got some really fun art in here, but it's we've got all these robots and all this kind of stuff. And so as the characters are exploring, it's basically it's as if they're exploring the Starship Warden. Now, Gary later on said that this ship that was in here was not intended to be the Warden, but it might as well be. It's the same concept. It's got multiple levels, different creatures, different environments, all kinds of stuff. So I ran this scenario for some friends once using pre-gen characters. And I tried to make it fun because I knew that a lot of them weren't going to like the idea once they figured it out that they were playing a science fantasy type game, because one of them very specifically hates science fantasy. He likes Star Wars. He's fine with that. But he doesn't when he plays D&D, he wants to play very hard fantasy Tolkien or the Black Company or Game of Thrones. Like that's his style of fantasy, and like putting a ray gun and a robot in that just doesn't do it for him. So, but anyway, I ran it for them, and it was fun, but they just weren't really into it. And unfortunately, the way it ended was there's a specific area in here. I think I talked about this before, but that's where all the characters died. So we just didn't even finish. Okay, so that's module S3. Now, one of the things that also Gary talks about in the Dungeon Master's Guide, 1979, and I have talked about this before because this was my favorite part of this book when I was a kid, one of my favorite parts. So page 1, yeah, I'm getting there. It's 113, something like that. Yep. Mutants and Magic. And so he says, readers of The Dragon might already be familiar with the concept of mixing science fantasy and heroic fantasy from reading my previous article about the adventures of a group of AD&D characters transported via a cursed scroll to another continuum and ending up amidst the androids and mutants aboard the starship Warden of Metamorphosis Alpha. Again, very typical Gary Gygax language. But basically, so the article that he's talking about in The Dragon, that's from Dragon number 17. So you see it here. And basically, he did a switcheroo. He surprised his players. They get transported, and the way he talks about it in the introduction here is James Ward's playing in this game. He's one of the players. And Gary says, hey, James, like Jim, whatever, do you happen to have like your maps and your notes for Metamorphosis Alpha, like with you? Like, are they available? And James is like, yeah. And Gary's like, oh, can you go get them? And then James leaves, and then Gary comes back, goes to Giznos, and he comes back. And when he's come back, Gary is now sitting where Jim was, and he's left the DM chair open. And he says, "Oh, you're going to run the game now. Like we are now on the Starship Warden." And so that's what happened. And I guess Jim was a little nervous because he felt like he didn't feel comfortable DMing for Gary, and I could see that. Like since Gary was one of the 2 co-creators of the game, trying to DM him might be a little intimidating, but in any event, that's what he's talking about here. So, but this article talks about mixing AD&D and Gamma World and how to do that. And as you see here, when I talked about this, it's very similar because Gamma World was designed to be compatible with AD&D. So you have strength, which is the equivalent of physical strength, intelligence, wisdom, and mental strength are the same. And then all the other abilities are the same. Gamma World characters do not have magic resistance, and D&D characters do not have radiation resistance. And then it goes on to talk about things like the armor class and what different armor is like from Gamma World to D&D, and doing the table. Now remember, this is in the days when we used descending armor class. So an armor class of 0 or -8 is significantly better than an armor class of 10. So it's just backwards now. We use ascending armor class in modern versions of D&D, but in basically any pre-Wizards of the Coast version of D&D, you used descending armor class. So he just talks about that and how to convert, and then he talks about saving throws, fighting ability, and you can see there's not a lot to talk about here because they're very, very similar. Rate of fire, okay, and then artifacts, spells, fatigue, mental combat, damage to hit bonuses. So very, very similar. Basically running a Gamma World character and a D&D game or vice versa takes up fewer than 2 pages in this book. It's basically 1 page once you kind of put it all together, 1.5, I guess. So I always liked that section as a kid because I wanted to play this. So I wanted to play Magic and Mutants with Thundar. Okay. So that's kind of it. Now I did talk about, that Gamma World influenced a lot of other things. So other role-playing games would be things like Aftermath from Fantasy Games Unlimited, I believe it was. And the Morrow Project. So those are both more on the military side. They're much more complex. Aftermath, probably needlessly so. People used to call it like things like before and aftermath or advanced math instead of aftermath because it was so complicated. But the Morrow Project is very similar to that Commandy comic I talked earlier about, which is the idea that like you've got characters who have been hidden in a bunker and now they're coming out to explore this post-Holocaust wasteland. And they've kind of been left unchanged, but again, very military-like, but lighter military than Aftermath. And then things like Twilight 2000, which is really a military game, but the idea is that you're playing a soldier as part of an army of at the time it was NATO, and you're stranded. I think it was in Poland after a limited nuclear exchange, and people kind of just given up. And so now you've got to survive and try to figure out how to get home. So kind of apocalyptic. So I thought the idea of all of those games was very intriguing. I have played Twilight 2000 before. Another game would be Mutant Future. So that is now what they call a retro clone. It's a relatively modern version of the game. So using the open game license, a company called Goblinoid Games created a retro clone of Moldvay Basic D&D that they called Labyrinth Lord. It has some changes, but at its heart, that's what it was trying to replicate. And then they wrote a post-apocalyptic version of Labyrinth Lord called Mutant Future. And Mutant Future is essentially like a retro clone of Gamma World. So that's kind of what it was intended to be, even though rules it's more similar to basic D&D than advanced D&D, but it's very, very similar in style. So, and I've played quite a bit of Mutant Future. So you've also got second edition of Gamma World. So this is basically the same game. It's just, revised. This was revised in 1983. So you see this great art here by Keith Parkinson. I loved this art a lot. This was what I thought Gamma World was. This is how I envisioned it in my head. Not funny, but kind of serious. So they've got this guy on. I think that's a Podog, it's called. But very, very typical. They're trying to make it look science fiction-y with the typefaces and all that kind of stuff. So there's one of your little bear guys. And anyway, this kind of just revises the game. It tries to tighten up some of the rules. So a lot of the DM or the referee, I keep saying DM, a lot of the referee flexibility that you get from first edition Gamma World is gone in this version of the game. And it's so there's a lot of things removed. There was a time manipulation mutation where a character can move back and forth through time, but there weren't a lot of mechanics behind it. It's very powerful. So that's missing from this version of the game. This is by James Ward. I mean, he worked on this, but they kind of, as a company decided that they needed to make the rules a little bit more strict, I guess, for lack of a better word. You've got some different androids here. And then this one is nice because it does illustrate all of the monsters. So before you didn't have illustrations of these guys. So these are really fun. And then, okay, so here's your Orlans. If you see these guys, I alluded to this earlier. You've got these two-headed creatures. And I mentioned how the creature in Orphans of the Sky, there was a creature that was a two-headed guy. So I think that maybe that was the inspiration for this, although it's not really a big stretch to think of a guy with two heads, but very similar in idea to that character from that book. So these are the Red Death, something of Entropy. I already forgot the name again. Friends of Entropy. Okay, so I think that's who these are. And again, very Mad Max Road Warrior type, which those movies didn't come out until after Gamma World was published in 1978. At least maybe Mad Max had come out by that point, the first one, but the Road Warrior, Road Warrior is the middle one, right? Of the original three. Anyway, the one that we normally think of, I think that definitely came out after Gamma World. All right, so that's second edition. There's some different. This was the adventure book, so there were two things that came in this box set. Here's the map, and it's much more. This is on a city basis. It's a hex map, but it's here's Pittsburgh as the city, and you've got all these different ports and things like that. But it's much smaller in scale than the other map. All right, and then you've got the Cleansing War of Garrick Blackhand. This is an adventure, and then the Mind Masters. Okay, and then you've got your referee screen. I mean, now not all these came in the box. I just put everything in here. And then character sheets. I always like the art for this. Okay, so that was the second edition. Really quick, I'm going to go back to first edition because I wanted to show you guys something that I think is really funny. It's all the way back here in the foreword where Tom Wham says, sorry, it's out of focus again. He says, the metric system was used in these rules for two primary reasons. First, science fiction fans are generally much better acquainted with the metric system than is the average citizen, and its use would thus not be foreign to them. Many sci-fi writers have been using the metric system in stories for years, and many others turn to it each year to lend a scientific flavor to their stories. Second, the U.S. is beginning to make the switch from the English system to the metric system of weights and measures, as the latter is used by most of the rest of the world. The more one uses these metric units, the more one understands them, and the easier the conversions become. So I just thought it was really funny. This is written in 1978, and he's talking about how the U.S. is moving to the metric system, which at the time it was. We were all told that that's what was going to happen, and we just never did. We stuck with the old English system. So. All right, so I talked a little bit about some influences that came out after Gamma World. So I want to talk about a couple of my experiences with the game, and also how you can use it in a D&D game. So I'm going to talk about that first. So this is just going back to those mutation tables, right? So this is my campaign notebook. If you've watched my campaign videos, I know some of you don't. You just watch the history ones, which is fine. But in this game, the characters were going through Keep on the Borderlands. And so I talked about at one point, there was a goblin alchemist, and the characters had gone in and they had destroyed his lab, which accidentally caught fire, and they had to escape. And as they escaped, they heard all these like bottles and flasks and things like bursting. Well, I decided what had happened was all these chemicals and alchemical agents and things had been released by this fire, either into the air, or they'd seeped into the water or into the food supply. But there are goblins still living there. So the characters were gone from the goblin cave for in-game terms, probably like, a few weeks or like whatever, but they eventually go back through the goblin caves, and they discovered a bunch of basically mutated goblins. So I had just grabbed some artwork that I found online. It's not necessarily the artwork that I would want to have used, but I couldn't find any mutant goblin artwork. But the idea was that these goblins have been mutated. And so I had come up with a table where I was giving them mutations that gave them like different abilities. And so I think that's a great idea that you can put into a standard D&D game. Be inspired by the mutation tables from these games from Gamma World, and then put that into your D&D games and change, to kind of give your creatures a different flavor to them so that they're not so predictable. Okay, and then another thing that happened with this game. So when I first started my blog back in 2011, I had kind of stumbled across into the old school D&D community, but I also found out that people were doing these like other games that I grew up with. So I mentioned Gamma World, and people at Goblinoid Games had created Mutant Future. And when I saw that, I was like, this is awesome, because I wanted to play Gamma World again, but I thought, it's so expensive to find now. They had done other editions of the game. There was the third edition that used the area control table or action control table that originally debuted the Marvel superheroes role-playing game, or the face rip system. And so that was third edition. Fourth edition was very much in line with second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And then there was the fifth edition, which was Alternity. And then it kind of went downhill from there, and they started going down the D20 path. And then the latest edition, I think, was the seventh edition of Gamma World, which was based on fourth edition Dungeons and Dragons from Wizards of the Coast. But in any event, I didn't want to use any of those. I wanted to use the original game. So I started creating content for Mutant Future. But then my friend Will, at the time, he was hosting a very popular game, a show on YouTube called Tabletop, that was about tabletop role-playing games. Or I'm sorry, it was about tabletop board games. And so he talked to me and one of my friends and said, hey, I want to do that same concept, but I want to do it for role-playing games, but I need to figure out like a system. What system should I run? And he didn't think that he wanted to use D&D. And at the time, I think the D&D system that was available was fourth. I don't think fifth had come out yet. And so he's like, I don't want to use D&D. I want to use something different, give exposure to a smaller game. Like, what can I do? And so my friend and I were talking to him, and one of the ideas that came up was thinking about running Savage Worlds. And so we went over to his house to play Savage Worlds. And my friend offered me up and said, Martin's been working on this post-apocalyptic setting. And I don't know why the idea of post-apocalyptic came up, whether it was Will's idea or my friend just mentioned it, but for whatever reason, they wanted to look at running a post-apocalyptic style setting, and they were trying to figure out the system to go with it. And I had been writing a post-apocalyptic setting for Gamma World, but using Mutant Future rules, and I'd been blogging about it, and I'd done quite a bit of work on it. And they said, well, can you run it in Savage Worlds? And I was like, yeah, I think so. And I basically did it on the fly. That's how Savage Worlds works. So I was familiar enough that the main thing I had to figure out was the mutations, but I gave everybody pre-gen characters and I tried to make it really fun and different. So as an example, I ran it sort of like Thundar-like. So one of the characters was a sorcerer that was a princess. And then one of the characters, and I think it was Will's character, I made him sort of an immortal, which is part of the storyline from the Horse Clan series of books that I showed earlier. So he was an immortal, but he was actually a former Nazi. I made it in the game. And so, he didn't want anybody to know. And that was part of his like character secret. And so everybody had their own little characters to play. So we played through it, and you can read about it. I'll put a link in the show notes to the blog. So Will blogged about it. Like, this is like more than 10 years ago. It was a long time ago. So, anyway, that was some of my fun that I've had. And I have a lot of Gamma World related content on my blog. So one of the things that was in this version of the game, the first edition here, there was all these, I talked about before, these encounter tables at the back, and they were based on terrain. Well, the first version of the game I got, half these encounter tables have been ripped out of the back of the book for whatever reason. And so I had to go through and figure out where they stopped, and then I made my own encounter tables, and I posted all those encounter tables on my blog. So if you just want to get a sense of like some of my weird, goofy ideas, I'll put links to that down below. Okay, and so also below, you'll find places where you can join me on social media, on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter and X, things like that. And you can also please leave a comment down there. I would really appreciate it. And you can also please like and subscribe to my video, like my video, subscribe to my channel, which is the best way to help my channel grow, is by sharing the video with other people that you think might enjoy it. So that's really going to be it for this particular video. Thank you so very much for watching. Don't forget also below, in addition to finding my blog, you can also find links to my shop, which is the best way to support my channel right now, is by buying designs from my shop. So you'll see some of those designs here, but they're all exclusive to my shop, and I had an artist work on them, and I hope that you enjoy some of those. So that's going to be it for now, and thank you again very, very much for watching. Happy gaming, stay safe, and I will talk to you next time. And now for the bonus content, what I was drinking, what I was listening to when I was working on this video. So first off, thank you so much for hanging out through the video. That was a very long video, and I know I said I was going to talk about Gamma World, and then I spent like the first 15 to 20 minutes talking about Metamorphosis Alpha, which probably the YouTube algorithm is going to tell me that was a terrible idea, but I felt that they were connected. But I wanted to mention Gamma World in the title of the video because I feel like it's the more known of the games. So, but you got a twofer, I guess. You got two games in one video. So I do hope that you enjoyed that. But what I was drinking and listening to. So took a lot of notes for this one. A lot of it was off the top of my head, which I think is obvious when you'll see I had to keep going back and forth because I forgot to mention things. So I do apologize for that. But as I've talked before, I try to do this more conversationally. I don't have a script. Part of the reason I don't have a script right now, I don't have a working printer. So my printer died and I've just been lazy. I haven't bought a new one because I don't really use it that much anyway. And so I handwrite some bullet points, but I often will forget to look at them while I'm talking. But in any event, so today's February 6th, and today is also, unfortunately, the day my mom passed away. It was 11 years ago today. It was very unexpected. She fell and never got back up. So her favorite drink at the end, as she was older, her favorite drink was Maker's Mark and 7-Up, Makers and 7. My dad will say Sprite. When I was a kid, I remember we had 7-Up in the house. I definitely remember the can. But in any event, Makers and 7. So I made a Makers and 7, and I can't quite show you the glass, but because I don't want to spill it. But these are the glasses that my parents used to have a beverage out of when I was little. My dad gave them to me, so they've got these green and gold stripes on them. And so this is what I grew up seeing my parents drink. They didn't drink a ton. That was very, very rare. But when they did drink, it was usually a 7 and 7, a bourbon 7. In the old days, it was Jim Beam. And then my mom changed it to Makers. So I'd make one of these. This is technically a highball style drink. It's just spirit. In this case, Maker's Mark, bourbon, and 7-Up. And so any soda that makes it what's called a highball. The ice cube you see here is a Death Star ice cube. I'm sure you can't make out the detail, but I promise you it was in there. So I'm going to take a quick sip here, and then I'm going to mention why I have the Star Wars stuff going on. Cheers to my mom. So now, now you can see the glass a little better as I spill it onto the table. Anyway, that's where the laser comes out on the Death Star, in case you weren't sure if that's what that was. But again, that glass. So quick funny story about Maker's Mark. So my mom died. She passed away. And so my wife and I rushed over, with my dad, and we're trying to help him out. And so one of the first things we did was go through his cupboards to see what kind of food he had. My mom did all the cooking. So we were trying to kind of help my dad out. And really funny, I found this bottle of Listerine in the kitchen cabinet. And Listerine like mouthwash. And most of us know it as green, but they also have a brown Listerine. And that's what she had. And I was like, Mom didn't use brown Listerine. I thought, this is so weird. I was like, Dad, why does Mom have a bottle of Listerine mouthwash in the kitchen, in the cupboard on the bottom shelf? And he's like, oh, you don't know what that is? And I was like, no. And he said, that's your mom's Maker's Mark. That's her bourbon. And she used to go on cruises with one of her friends, Lou. And so when she and Lou went on the cruise, because they didn't want to pay for booze, my mom smuggled bourbon onto the ship in a Listerine bottle, which is just hilarious, because if you knew my mom, she was not a rule breaker by any means. So that was just a funny little thing that she did. And it makes it sound like she drank a lot. She really didn't. So it was just funny that we found this bottle. All right. So Star Wars, what's going on with this? Well, my mom took me and, the family, my mom, dad, and sister, and I went to see Star Wars in the theater in May of 1977. So I would have been about 6.5 years old. And then that Christmas rolled around and they re-released the movie into the theaters. And my mom asked my dad to take me because she knew how much I loved this movie. And so it was the first movie that I ever saw twice in the theater. I didn't even know that was a thing that you could do. Like going back to the theater to see the same movie was just something that my family didn't do because it was very expensive. And, I thought that was something rich people did. So, but because my mom saw that I was getting into this, she started helping buy things. And so I was taking piano lessons at the time. She bought the sheet music for the music. She would get Star Wars figures for me. And so I had that original set that you had to order, and you got the little note that said like, oh, they're not ready yet, but when they're ready, you'll get them. Like, so you didn't get the figures, you got the note that said the figures were coming because they hadn't made enough. And so I have that original set of, I think it was 8 figures, might've been 12, whatever it was. And I still have them all. They're all opened, of course. I played with them, but she got the figures. And then this record. So this is my original record from 1977. And it's a gatefold. It's a double album. And what's really funny is one of the things that you'll notice on the records is that if you see, this is side 3. And this is side 2. So you might be wondering where's side 1 and side 4. Well, they're on the other record. So they were, rather than doing side 1, side 2 on one record and then side 3, side 4, which is how you get it now. So I have a newer version of this, double LP. Everything else looks the same. Like the jacket's the same. Everything else, the actual LPs, I think, are gold, but other than that, it looks the same. But they're numbered like 1 and 2 and then 3 and 4. This is numbered 1 and 4 and 2 and 3. And that's because in the old days, the fancy turntables that you could get, they would flip the records for you. And so what you did was you had, the 1 and 4 like this. So it's 1 and 4. And then you'd have 2 and 3. And so what would happen, side 1 would play, and then it would flip the record like this, and then side 2 would come up and it would play this, and then it would move it over, and then it would, or it would flip it over and somehow, and then it would end up playing. Yeah, it would flip it over, and then it would play side 3 and then side 4, right? So 1, 4, 2, 3. And so it played it in order. I probably way over explained that, but I think you guys get it. So in any event, I was thinking about my mom again, because her encouraging me to like something like this, which was a brand new concept at the time, Star Wars and things like that. Like because one of the things that she got from this from me as well was the Marvel Comics Star Wars comic books. And those are the first comic books I ever read. Reading those comic books got me interested in reading other comic books by Marvel that I later on got. And then comic books, and then all of that kind of rolled on together to help me get into D&D. So my mom encouraged all these, like what we've now called geeky habits of mine or geeky passions. And she was totally cool about it. And I just loved that about her. And, I do miss her. And so I like to think about her on this day. I think about her every day, but especially on a day like today. So thanks for sitting through all that. If you stayed this long, I appreciate the, you sharing that story with me. And cheers to my mom, and cheers to all of you for watching.